Hello, I'm Brigantia, Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Friday. It's time to discuss another fairy tale. We're going to look at Hansel and Gretel, which is extremely well known, and I think it's arguably one of the darker fairy tales in the Western canon. But nevertheless, it is told and retold every generation, almost as if its morbidity is part of its appeal rather than a reason to flee from it. Storytelling is a way we can experiment with learning how to deal with fear, trauma, death in a controlled and a safe way. It's as if we're programming our neural pathways. We can touch that which is frightening to us without actually being in danger. There seems to be a human need to do this. Without the ability to process fear and that which causes it, we are not equipped to successfully navigate life. We do need to toughen ourselves up, because otherwise the first bump we hit in the road will cause us to collapse. And given the hyper-emotional society we live in and the several generations in of permissive parenting styles, there are an increasing number of people who are unable to cope with criticism and just general misfortune that everyone experiences, let alone major trauma. The consequence is a weakened society and a very fragile civilization. I'm reminded of the old saying that the boy is the father of the man. In other words, how we are raised in childhood sets the stage for how we fare as adults. Learning to deal with stress, other forms of pressure, and fear brings lifelong benefits. Instinctively, we know this, which is why fairy tales and children's fiction in general has traditionally drawn upon scary ideas. It's instructive as well as entertaining. It presents very difficult lessons in a form that children can digest, even if they won't understand the full implications of these ideas until they're years and years older. So, the story. It's fairly straightforward. There was a large forest, and a woodcutter lived there with his wife and children. They were very poor, and a famine came to the land, and the woodcutter could no longer feed his family. Not knowing what to do, the woodcutter consulted his wife one evening, asking how could he feed the children when he couldn't even feed himself or her. The wife, who was the children's stepmother, not their mother, suggested that they take the children out into the woods the next day and just leave them there. The man was distraught by the very idea. He said he couldn't possibly abandon them for fear that they starve on their own or they could be attacked by wild animals. Anything could happen to them. The wife argued that if he didn't do this, then all four of them would starve, and finally the man agreed to her plan. Very, very weak, that. But unbeknownst to either party, the children had overheard this entire conversation. Gretel cried, not knowing what to do, but Hansel comforted her, and he assured her that he would think of a plan. And after he was certain that the adults were asleep, he went outside, and he noticed that there were little pebbles that just glistened in the moonlight. He stashed as many pebbles as he could in his pockets, went back to the house, and told Gretel not to worry. The next morning the stepmother roused the children and told them they were all going to go into the forest to collect wood. She gave them a piece of bread, telling them to save it for their dinner because there was going to be nothing else for them. Gretel kept the bread in her apron, and Hansel made sure that he had his pebbles in his pockets. The family left for the forest, and Hansel began to drop the pebbles so that he and his sister could retrace their steps. So they go deep into the forest. The father, the stepmother, they build a fire. They tell the children to stay there, rest, keep warm, and promise to come back for them after they finish cutting wood. Time passed. Dinner time came, and Hansel and Gretel ate their bread. Eventually the children grew tired, they fell asleep, and when they woke up again it was night, and as they had suspected, their parents had not come for them. The moon rose, shining a light on the reflective pebbles, and they followed the trail Hansel had made and eventually found their way home. They then knocked on the door, it opened, and they were immediately scolded by their stepmother for having overslept in the forest. But they were warmly welcomed by their father, who had been feeling guilty, as he well should. The famine in the land worsened, and again the woodcutter and his wife debated what to do. The wife said to take the children even further into the forest, so there was no chance they could find their way back, because there was no other way to save themselves. The woodcutter objected. He said it would be better if she shared the last of their bread with the children, but the wife would brook no refusal, and eventually he gave in. and as before, Hansel and Gretel had overheard the conversation. Hansel tried to go out to collect more pebbles, but he discovered that the door to the cabin was locked. Gretel was frightened, but her brother promised to figure out a way to get them home again. Morning came. The children were given an even smaller piece of bread than they had before. They were taken into the forest, much deeper, in an area the children had never laid eyes on. Hansel made sure to drop crumbs of bread, hoping it would leave enough of a trail to follow later. Eventually, the woodcutter and his wife stopped. They built the fire, told the children to stay put so that they could collect them later. And again, Hansel and Gretel waited. They slept and found that night had fallen with no sign of their parents. They tried to follow the trail of breadcrumbs, but they couldn't find it again, and soon it became clear that the birds had eaten up the trail. So they wandered through the night and into the next morning. The children happened upon some berries, ate them, but eventually they were exhausted, laid down under a tree, and slept. And for days like this they wandered, ever deeper into the forest, until they came across a peculiar house. It was built of bread and cake, and its windows were a clear sugar glass. Hansel and Gretel excitedly ran up to the house and began eating it. A voice came from the house asking what was going on, but the children were so hungry they couldn't stop eating. Then out of the front door an ancient woman on crutches emerged. The sight of her frightened Hansel and Gretel so much they dropped the pieces of the house that they had in their hands. At first the old woman seemed kind. She sympathized with their plight, invited them in, and fed them. Then she made up little beds for Hansel and Gretel, and she let them sleep. The children thought all was well and that they had found a safe haven. In the morning the tables were turned, and the old woman revealed herself as a wicked witch. She trapped Hansel in a cage and chained up Gretel, announcing her intention to fatten them up and eat them. Now, this particular witch was very short-sighted, so when she tried to check on whether or not Hansel was getting plump enough to eat, she didn't notice that he was holding out a little twig or a piece of bone for her to squish instead of his finger. Finally, the witch got tired of this and decided to just eat them, whether they were fattened up or not, and she ordered Gretel to go heat up the oven. Gretel feigned ignorance, and the witch got exasperated and began to prepare the oven herself, even going so far as to stick her head into the oven. Gretel seized this opportunity. She pushed the wicked witch into the oven and shut the door. The witch screeched, but Gretel did not open it. Indeed, then she freed her brother Hansel, and then after the witch was dead and they knew she couldn't hurt them any more, they searched the witch's house and they discovered chest upon chest full of pearls and jewels. Hansel stuffed his pockets and Gretel filled her apron with them. Then the children began to try to find their way home again, and after a time they did find an area of the forest that was familiar to them, and eventually they found their way home. The children rushed into the house and embraced their father. He had been racked with guilt since abandoning them, and he rejoiced at their return. To the children's surprise, their stepmother wasn't there. She had died while they were away. Then the children showed their father the riches they had taken from the witch's house. From that day forward, they all lived together in happiness. This story wrestles with truly disturbing ideas, and it's rather amazing that it's presented in such a way as to be a story for children, but it does successfully introduce a complex idea that evil does exist in the world, and everyone has to learn how to confront and deal with it. In this tale, we have a spineless father who won't protect his children, a malicious stepmother who thinks nothing of sacrificing the children just to save herself, and there we have the dangers inherent in the forest. We have cannibalism and false saviors. It is a sad reality that sometimes parents fail their children, and not all step-parents make room in their hearts for the children under their care. The natural world is filled with dangerous animals that can hurt us, and while we don't have much in the way of literal cannibalism going on these days, we certainly have plenty of destructive ideas that eat away at people's souls, and the world is filled with would-be saviors that are just as lethal as the witch in this story. Significantly, what saved the children was not some divine intervention, but it was their own wits. Hansel figured out ways to retrace their steps, and Gretel seized the moment to dispose of the witch. And the witch is clearly a guise for their stepmother, who lacked any fragment of maternal feeling towards the children. This story teaches a hard lesson, that there are moments in life when we are going to be on our own, and if we're going to make it, we're going to have to be clever and resourceful. Self-reliance is an essential trait to learn, and today's youth are done a great disservice when they are discouraged and prevented from doing so, and we have an alarming number of adults who are long overdue to grapple with this concept and to put it into practice. It is one of the core causes of our upside-down world, a lack of self-reliance. The tale of Hansel and Gretel has something to teach us all. So now's the time to let me know what you think about all this. Let me know in the comments below, or come see us on Gilded. There's a link to join us in the description box. Just click on it. It'll take you right to us. Say hello, and we can talk storytelling as much as you like. But that'll do it for this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.